The Stargate had seen stranger things than a silver capsule breaching the iris. Not many, but a few. The event began at 0347 hours on a Tuesday, which was, in Sergeant Walter Harriman's professional opinion, exactly the kind of hour when nothing good ever came through the gate. The chevrons had locked in the standard sequence, but the coordinates were garbage. Scrambled. Like someone had dialed Earth's address from a DHD that was on fire. The wormhole established anyway, spitting a crackling column of unstable energy into the gate room that popped every circuit breaker on sublevel 28 before the kawoosh even fully retracted. Then the capsule came through. It hit the ramp at an angle, shedding sparks and a smell like burned ozone and old metal, and came to rest against the blast door with a resonant clang that echoed up through 3 floors of Cheyenne Mountain. The iris had tried to close. It hadn't been fast enough. Whatever that object was, it had threaded the gap between activation and lockdown with the kind of precision that either meant extraordinary engineering or extraordinary luck. SG-1 was in the gate room inside 4 minutes. O'Neill arrived with his P-90 at low ready and the expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the universe and had simply started being annoyed by it instead. "Tell me that's not a bomb," he said. "It's not a bomb, sir," Carter said, already crouching beside it with a scanner, her voice carrying the particular focused energy she got when something genuinely puzzled her. "It's a cryopreservation unit. Old design, the metallurgy is late 20th century, but the internal systems are—" She paused. "More advanced. Like the exterior and the interior were built 100 years apart." Daniel was reading the markings along the capsule's flank. "NASA," he said. "And a serial designation. Buck Rogers Project, Experimental Deep Space Endurance Trial." He looked up. "I don't remember a Buck Rogers project." "Neither does anyone else," General Hammond said from the control room above, his voice coming through the intercom with the measured weight of a man already calculating the security implications. "Because it's not in any declassified record I've ever seen. Seal the gate room. Get Fraser down here. Nobody touches that capsule until we know what's inside it." What was inside it, as it turned out, was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-30s by appearance, and he came out of the cryo unit swinging. Not metaphorically. The capsule cracked open along its seam with a hiss of preserved atmosphere, and before the medics could reach him, the occupant had rolled off the interior cradle, planted both feet on the gate room floor, and put his back against the nearest wall with his hands raised in a posture that was equal parts surrender and threat assessment. His eyes swept the room, the armed soldiers, the Stargate, the blast-scarred ramp, Daniel Jackson holding a tablet, Tilk standing very still with the kind of quiet that large, dangerous people cultivate when they're deciding whether a situation requires violence. The man's gaze settled on O'Neill. "I'm going to need," he said, his voice rough from disuse but steadying fast, "somebody to explain what year it is. And I want the truth this time." O'Neill lowered his P-90 approximately 2 inches. "What happened last time? Last time someone told me it was the 25th century and I was in New Chicago." The man's jaw tightened. "I'm starting to think that might have been wrong." His name, as the SGC would learn over the next 6 hours of careful, escalating conversation, was William Rogers. Captain, United States Air Force. Mission specialist on an experimental deep space endurance trial launched from Kennedy Space Center in 1987, during which a malfunction in his life support system had sent his capsule into an unplanned hibernation trajectory that was supposed to have killed him and hadn't. He had been asleep for, as best anyone could calculate, somewhere between 500 and 503 years, depending on which relativistic model Carter applied. His capsule had been recovered, revived, and relocated at least once before arriving here, though by whom and under what circumstances remained, for the moment, classified under the broader category of things Buck Rogers didn't fully understand yet. He understood more than they expected. That was the first surprise. He asked about the gate before anyone had explained it to him, having apparently spent the last 4 minutes of his decontamination window studying the inactive ring through the observation window with the focused attention of a pilot cataloging an unfamiliar instrument panel. He asked about the soldiers' weapons with the professional interest of a man who had carried weapons and knew the difference between a firearm built for deterrence and one built for use. He asked, quietly and without apparent distress, whether Earth was at war. "Define at war," O'Neill said. Buck Rogers looked at him with eyes that had already seen one impossible future and arrived, somehow, at a second one. "Are people dying because of things that come through that ring?" O'Neill was quiet for a moment. Around them, the gate room hummed with residual energy, the great ring dormant and patient, the ramp still faintly warm from an arrival no one had authorized and no one could yet explain. "Yeah," O'Neill said. "They are." Buck nodded. Once. The expression on his face was not despair. It was something more durable than that, the particular, weathered acceptance of a man who had learned that the universe does not arrange itself around human comfort, and had decided some time ago that this was not going to stop him. "Then I'd like to help," he said. "If you'll let me." If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Indeed. General George Hammond had, in his years commanding the SGC, developed a reliable instinct for the difference between a security threat and a security complication. Threats got contained. Complications got managed. Buck Rogers, he was increasingly certain, was a complication. The man had been in the mountain for 31 hours. In that time he had submitted to 4 medical examinations without complaint, consumed an unremarkable amount of commissary food with remarkable enthusiasm, correctly identified 3 separate structural weaknesses in sublevel 28's ventilation layout that the SGC's own security team had flagged 2 years ago and never fully addressed, and charmed every nurse on DR. Fraser's staff while simultaneously declining to answer any question he considered operationally sensitive until he'd spoken with someone he described as whoever's actually in charge. Hammond had come down personally. He wasn't sure yet whether that was a compliment to Rogers or a concession. They sat across from each other in one of the mountain's smaller briefing rooms, not the main one, not yet. With a folder of declassified summary materials between them and 2 armed airmen outside the door who Buck had already clocked, assessed, and apparently dismissed as non-threatening within 30 seconds of sitting down. "You were a test pilot," Hammond said. "Among other things." Buck's hands were flat on the table. Still. A man who'd learned that stillness communicated trustworthiness, or had simply been still long enough that it came naturally. Experimental deep space endurance. The Rogers Project was about seeing how long a human body could sustain cryopreservation under real solar wind conditions. I was the first volunteer. And the only one, it seems. Program got defunded. A slight tightening around his eyes. 3 weeks after I launched. Hammond let that sit for a moment. The particular weight of institutional abandonment. Hammond had seen it before, in men who'd been sent into situations the Pentagon later decided it couldn't officially acknowledge. He recognized the specific quality of bitterness Rogers was not quite expressing. "Dr. Fraser's report says you're in exceptional physical condition given your circumstances," Hammond said. "She also says your neurological profile is, and I'm quoting, inconsistent with someone who spent 5 centuries in uninterrupted suspension. There are adaptation markers she doesn't have a framework for." "I wasn't in uninterrupted suspension," Buck said. "I was revived once before. Wherever I was, whenever I was, someone woke me up, debriefed me, and put me back under when I became inconvenient." His tone was even. "I'd like to know who. And I'd like to know how I ended up coming through what appears to be a very large alien transportation device in the basement of a NORAD facility." "That," Hammond said, "is a longer conversation." "I've got time, General." "Apparently I've got nothing but time." Hammond studied him. Rogers met the look without aggression and without the particular performative openness that people used when they were trying to appear cooperative while concealing something. He was simply present, attentive, waiting. Hammond made a decision. He told him. Not everything. Enough. The gate, the program, the gold, framed in the careful, practiced language Hammond had developed over years of briefing people whose worldviews were about to be structurally altered. He watched Buck's face as he absorbed it. The man didn't interrupt. Didn't express disbelief. Asked two clarifying questions, one about the parasitic nature of the symbiote, one about the gate network's geographic scope. That told Hammond he was processing tactically rather than emotionally. When Hammond finished, Buck was quiet for a moment. False gods, he said. With armies. And sarcophagus technology that extends their hosts' lives. That's accurate. And Earth has been fighting them through a ring-shaped portal for how long? Several years. Buck nodded slowly. In my time, the future I woke up in, Earth had enemies too. Different ones. But the shape of it was similar. Small force, limited resources, trying to hold a line against something bigger and better equipped. He paused. We managed. How? A brief, genuine smile. Stubbornness. Mostly. The tension in the room shifted by several degrees. Hammond found himself recalibrating, not his threat assessment, which remained cautious, but something more instinctive. The read he took on men when he was deciding whether they were the kind that held under pressure. O'Neill was waiting outside the briefing room when Hammond emerged. He'd been leaning against the corridor wall with his arms crossed and the studied nonchalance of a man who was absolutely listening through the door. Well? O'Neill said. He's not a threat. I know he's not a threat. I knew that when he put his back against the wall instead of going for cover behind the ramp. O'Neill fell into step beside him. Threat assessment instinct. He was protecting his six, not preparing to attack. Special forces habit. A pause. Or test pilot habit. They're not that different. He wants to be useful. Hammond said. Yeah. O'Neill's voice carried a particular flatness. That's what worries me. It was Carter who made the practical argument, in the main briefing room that afternoon with the full team assembled and Buck Rogers sitting at the far end of the table looking like a man who had attended many military briefings in his life and found most of them equally frustrating. His knowledge base is genuinely useful, she said. He has working familiarity with propulsion systems that are theoretically beyond our current development, tactical frameworks for small unit space combat, and a psychological profile for sustained displacement that our people are still trying to develop from scratch. She glanced at Buck. No offense. None taken, Buck said. You're describing me like I'm a research asset. You are a research asset. I know. I'm choosing to find it flattering. He looked at O'Neill. What do I have to do to get off this sublevel? O'Neill looked at Hammond. Hammond gave the fractional nod that meant your call, Colonel. You come with us, O'Neill said. Off-world. One mission. Low-risk assessment, no gold activity in the sector, friendly local population, basically a geological survey with better scenery. He leaned forward. You follow orders, keep up, and don't do anything heroic. Buck Rogers looked at the Stargate visible through the briefing room window, that great, patient ring, waiting. Define heroic, he said. O'Neill closed his eyes briefly. P3X774 smelled like pine resin and ozone, which Daniel said was probably atmospheric, and O'Neill said was probably fine, and Tilk said nothing about because Tilk rarely editorialized on planetary atmospheres unless they were actively trying to kill someone. Buck stepped through the gate and stopped. He had been told what to expect. Carter had briefed him on the dematerialization process with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely loved explaining things, and he had listened carefully and understood approximately 60% of it and nodded through the rest. He had braced for disorientation, for nausea, for the particular wrongness of having your molecules scattered across a wormhole and reassembled somewhere several light years from where you started. What he hadn't braced for was the sky. P3X774 had 2 moons, both visible in the late afternoon, one large and rust-colored and close enough to show surface detail, the other a smaller pale crescent riding high above the tree-line. The sun was slightly orange-tinged, the light falling differently than Earth light, softer at the edges, heavier in the middle distances, and the forest ahead was wrong in small, specific ways that his brain kept trying to correct and couldn't. The trees were too tall. The shadows pulled in the wrong directions. The birdsong, if it was birdsong, had one note too many. He stood on the gate platform for 4 seconds longer than operationally necessary. First time's always something, O'Neill said, not unkindly, moving past him to sweep the perimeter. I've been to other planets, Buck said. Through a wormhole? No. Then it's still your first time. The mission parameters were straightforward. SG-1 had visited P3X774 6 months prior, made contact with a low-technology agrarian population called the Verani, established preliminary diplomatic relations, and flagged the planet for follow-up assessment. Today's objective was to re-establish contact, check on an aquata deposit Carter had detected in the eastern ridge, and confirm the Verani had seen no gold activity since the last visit. 3 objectives. Estimated duration, 6 hours. O'Neill had described it as a milk run, which Buck understood to mean it was the kind of mission that went wrong in small, manageable ways rather than large, catastrophic ones. He was adjusting his expectation on that front by the 40-minute mark. The Verani village was where the mission files said it would be, a collection of timber and stone structures arranged around a central well, agricultural terraces climbing the hillside behind it, smoke rising from cooking fires in the early evening air. What the mission files had not noted, because it hadn't been true 6 months ago, was the Jaffa patrol. 4 of them. Heavy armor, staff weapons, moving through the village perimeter with the particular mechanical confidence of men who had never had reason to doubt their authority over the people around them. The villagers moved differently when the Jaffa were near, a collective tightening, a studied avoidance of eye contact, the precise behavioral vocabulary of people who had learned that visibility invites attention. Buck recognized it. He had seen it before, in a different future, on different worlds. The specific way people moved under occupation. SG-1 pulled back into the tree-line without a word exchanged. The communication was physical, O'Neill's raised fist, Carter's immediate shift left, Tilk's controlled stillness. Buck matched them and stayed quiet, which O'Neill would later note in his mission report as the moment he started taking Rogers seriously. Gold, Tilk said barely above breath. The armor bears the mark of who you are. He's been dead for 2 years, Carter murmured. His forces have not all been absorbed. Remnant patrols still operate in border systems. Tilk's eyes tracked the patrol's movement. They seek tribute and slaves. They are not here under specific orders. Freelancers, O'Neill said. Great. Buck was counting. 4 visible. Likely 2 more at minimum in a standard patrol rotation, positioned on the opposite perimeter. Staff weapons, he'd been briefed on those. Effective range, accuracy profile, the particular vulnerability window between charge and discharge. He was also watching the villagers, reading the behavioral map of the square, tracking which structures had movement behind shuttered windows and which were genuinely empty. There's a family in the building to the left of the well, he said quietly. 3, maybe 4 people. They closed the shutters when the patrol passed, but the shadow under the door is still moving. They're deciding whether to run. O'Neill looked at him sideways. If they run, the patrol notices, Buck continued. We've got maybe 4 minutes before the rotation brings 2 more soldiers around that eastern building and pins the family against the well with nowhere to go. You got all that from the shadows? Test pilots read their instruments. You just have to know which instruments to look at. O'Neill was quiet for approximately 1 second. Carter, can you get to the DHD from the south approach without the patrol seeing you? If Tilk draws their attention to the north, yes. Tilk? I am able to create a distraction that will occupy their attention for approximately 90 seconds. Buck. O'Neill's voice was level, measuring. You're with me. We're going to be very casual and very visible coming out of those trees from the west, because 4 Jaffa soldiers seeing 2 humans walking openly toward them are going to make assumptions about those humans that I want them to make. He paused. Can you look non-threatening? Buck considered the question with genuine seriousness. I've been told I have an approachable face. Let's hope so. What followed was the kind of operation that didn't have an official name in SGC protocol manuals because it relied too heavily on variables that couldn't be trained: timing, nerve, and the specific human capacity for projecting confident harmlessness while doing something extremely dangerous. O'Neill walked out of the tree-line with his weapon slung and his hands visible, and the body language of a man who owned every piece of ground he stood on. Buck matched him stride for stride, which required a conscious recalibration of every instinct that was telling him to find cover. Tilk's distraction, a staff weapon discharge into the tree canopy on the north perimeter, followed by what Buck could only assume was a very convincing impression of panicked flight, pulled 3 of the 4 Jaffa exactly where O'Neill had predicted. The 4th turned toward Buck and O'Neill and leveled his staff weapon and said something in a language Buck didn't speak. O'Neill answered in the same language. Calmly. 2 sentences. The Jaffa's posture shifted, not relaxed but uncertain. Uncertainty was exploitable. Buck smiled at the Jaffa. The specific, guileless, open smile he deployed in alien courts and hostile diplomatic chambers, and at least one situation involving a draconian ambush that he still didn't entirely like thinking about. The smile that said, I am not a threat, and I have no idea why you'd think I was. The Jaffa stared at him. Carter reached the DHD. The family by the well ran. The debrief lasted 2 hours longer than O'Neill thought it should, which meant it lasted approximately the right amount of time by everyone else's standards. Hammond listened to the full account of the P3X774 encounter with the particular patience of a man who had learned that the details SG-1 considered minor were frequently the ones that mattered most. The Varani had been shaken but unharmed. The Jaffa patrol had been neutralized, 2 stunned, 2 driven off. Without staff weapon discharge into the village proper. The family by the well had been a grandmother, her daughter, and 2 children under the age of 6. Carter had gotten them clear. The Naquata deposit remained unassessed, which O'Neill noted in his report with the resigned tone of a man who had stopped expecting geological surveys to go as planned. What Hammond kept returning to, in the quiet of his office afterward, was the section of Carter's supplemental report describing Buck Rogers in the field. Subject demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and threat assessment capability. Behavioral observation instincts comparable to Tilk's and practical application. Followed tactical direction without hesitation. Made one independent decision, interpersonal engagement with hostile Jaffa, that was not sanctioned but proved effective. Recommend expanded field evaluation, *. O'Neill's supplemental was shorter. It read, *, he didn't get anyone killed and he didn't do anything stupid. For a first outing that's better than Daniel's average. Recommend keeping him, *. Daniel had filed a formal objection to that characterization. Hammond had read it, appreciated it, and filed it. The question of what, exactly, to do with Buck Rogers was becoming more pressing. The NID had already made 3 separate inquiries about the cryocapsule's technology and the nature of the arrival. Hammond had answered all 3 with the bureaucratic patience of a man who knew how to make obstruction look like cooperation. But the NID's interest in anomalous individuals with unusual knowledge bases was well documented and not benign, and the window for keeping Rogers's presence quiet was closing. He authorized the expanded field evaluation. SG-1's next mission took them to Chilak. Not the planet itself, not the heart of it, not the populated regions where Apophis had once maintained his seat of power, and where the Jaffa still lived in the complicated aftermath of a god's repeated deaths. The destination was a secondary settlement on Chulak's southern continent, a village that Tilk had identified as sympathetic to the growing rebellion movement. The mission objective was liaison, a message to be delivered to a Jaffa elder named Ragnar, a man whose influence over 3 neighboring settlements made him a potentially significant ally for the Free Jaffa cause. It was, in theory, a diplomatic mission. Buck had been to enough diplomatic missions to know that the theory was usually the least interesting part. They came through the gate at midday local time, into a landscape that was simultaneously brutal and beautiful, Chulak's sky a deeper blue than Earth's, almost violet at the zenith, the air carrying the dry heat of a planet with less axial tilt and more exposed rock face. The settlement was 3 kilometers from the gate, accessible by a road that was actually a road rather than a footpath, which Tilk noted was a sign of relative prosperity. Jaffa build roads when they expect to use them for generations, he said. It is a statement of permanence. Or stubbornness, O'Neill said. Those are not different things among my people. Buck walked beside Tilk, which had become his default position on mission. Partly tactical. Tilk's read on threat environments was the best on the team, and proximity meant access to that read in real time. Partly something else, harder to articulate. Tilk was the only member of SG-1 who treated Buck's displacement not as a curiosity or a complication but as a simple fact, the way one might acknowledge the weather. Your world, Tilk said without preamble. In the future where you first awoke. Were there enslaved peoples? Buck was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. Different circumstances. But yes. And did they achieve freedom? Some of them. It took time. And it costs. He paused. It always costs. Tilk nodded slowly. The Jaffa have served false gods for 3,000 years. There are those among us who cannot conceive of existence without that service. Not because they are weak. He said the last words with particular precision. But because the framework of one's entire life is difficult to dismantle, even when one understands it to be built on lies. I know, Buck said. And meant it. Ragnar met them at the settlement's edge. He was older than Buck had expected. Weathered, with the particular physical authority of a man who had survived things that killed most people, and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to read strangers quickly and accurately. He greeted Tilk with the formal Jaffa-clasped forearm gesture and O'Neill with the polite wariness he apparently reserved for Tauri in general, and he looked at Buck for a long moment without speaking. You are not of the SGC, he said finally. It wasn't a question. Not exactly, Buck said. He is an ally, Tilk said. His circumstances are unusual. Among the Tauri, Ragnar said slowly, unusual circumstances often mean gold involvement. Not this time, Buck said. I got here the complicated way. No gold required. Something shifted in Ragnar's expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. He gestured toward the settlement interior, and they followed him through a gate of worked stone into a courtyard where 6 other Jaffa were waiting, all armed, all watching SG-1 with the layered attention of warriors doing precise tactical math. The meeting that followed was tense, careful, and conducted in both English and Gold, with Tilk translating the latter for Buck in quiet asides. Ragnar's position on the rebellion was nuanced, sympathetic but not yet committed. He had children in 2 of the neighboring settlements. He had seen what happened to Jaffa who moved too early against their system lords. He wanted guarantees the SGC could not honestly provide. It was Daniel who carried most of the diplomatic weight, as he usually did. Patient, specific, drawing on historical parallels with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his career finding common language across impossible cultural distances. O'Neill provided military credibility. Tilk provided personal testimony that no amount of diplomatic framing could replicate. Buck mostly listened. And watched. He watched Ragnar's eldest son. A young warrior, maybe 20, standing at his father's left shoulder with the rigid posture of someone performing certainty he didn't entirely feel. He watched the way the young man's eyes moved when Tilk spoke about freedom, the specific hunger there, quickly suppressed, the way you suppress things you weren't sure you were allowed to want. He had seen that look before. In a different century. On faces that had eventually decided to want it anyway. At the meal that followed. A formal gesture of conditional trust, Tilk explained, Buck found himself seated across from Rachnor's son, whose name was Dracy, and who spoke enough English to be dangerous and enough pride to be interesting. "You are a warrior?" Dracy asked, with the blunt directness of youth. "Pilot," Buck said. "But yes. You have fought gold?" "I've fought things that thought they were gods," Buck said. "It turns out the principle is similar." Dracy looked at him with the particular intensity of someone filing information away for later. "My father says the Tauri are useful but cannot be trusted." "Your father's probably right to be careful," Buck said. "Most of the time when someone tells you to trust them, the fact that they're saying it is the reason you shouldn't." He picked up something that functioned approximately like bread and examined it. Trust is a thing you build. It takes more than one meeting. Dracy was quiet for a moment. "Then why are you here?" Buck looked across the courtyard to where O'Neill was enduring what appeared to be a detailed account of Jaffa military history with the stoic expression of a man who had made peace with his circumstances. "Same reason anybody goes anywhere," Buck said. "To figure out if it's worth it." This was, Buck was learning, less a security measure than a philosophical position. The tunnels moved. The crystals that grew them could be dissolved and regrown in hours, leaving no trace on a planet's surface that anything had been there at all. The Tok'are existed in a state of perpetual impermanence that their allies found operationally frustrating, and the Tok'are themselves seemed to regard as a point of quiet pride. "They've been fighting the gold for 2,000 years, Carter explained, as SG-1 waited in the gate room for final coordinates to be transmitted. "Without a homeworld, without a fleet, without an army. Just intelligence, patience, and the willingness to live inside the enemy." "Literally," O'Neill added. Buck had read the Tok'are briefing materials that Hammond had authorized for his access level. He had read them twice, which was his standard practice with any intelligence product he didn't fully trust, on the basis that the second reading usually revealed what the first reading was trying to make you not notice. The Tok'are files were interesting in their omissions. There was a great deal about what the Tok'are could do and very little about what they wanted, the long-term strategic objective that 2,000 years of patient resistance was actually building toward. He had flagged this to Daniel, who had given him the look of a man who had been having exactly that concern for years and was gratified someone else had finally noticed. The mission was a scheduled intelligence exchange. The Tok'are had information about a gold fleet movement in a sector the SGC monitored for Earth approach vectors. SG-1 had a data package from the SGC's own deep space sensors. The exchange was routine, the sixth in a series, Carter said, all conducted without incident. Buck had learned to treat the phrase "without incident" as a challenge the universe had not yet accepted. The planet was designated P34-353J, a cold, geologically active world with tunnel systems that suited Tok'are crystal technology, and an atmosphere that made extended surface exposure inadvisable. They came through the gate into a narrow rock canyon, wind cutting sideways off a ridge of black basalt, and followed a set of coordinates to a section of canyon wall that was, to all appearances, solid stone. Tilk pressed his palm flat against it, and a section dissolved inward. The tunnels were exactly as the files had described, luminescent crystal walls casting amber light, corridors branching in patterns that felt organic rather than architectural, the faint hum of technology operating below audible frequency. Buck catalogued it with the same instinctive thoroughness he applied to any new environment, and came to the conclusion that the Tok'are were very good at making comfort feel like surveillance. Their contact was a Tok'are named Anise. Buck had encountered, in his previous future, several categories of individual who combined exceptional intelligence with motivations they considered too sophisticated to explain to lesser minds. He recognized the type immediately and adjusted his approach accordingly, which was to say, he became very attentive and very careful about everything he volunteered. Anise was genuinely brilliant. This was obvious and probably intentional. She had the particular quality of someone who allowed their competence to do work that charm might otherwise handle, and she watched Buck with an interest that was scientific in texture but not entirely in intent. "You are the temporal anomaly," she said by way of greeting. "I prefer Buck," he said. "Your cryocapsule's arrival generated a measurable subspace signature. Several gold monitoring stations detected it. They have not yet identified the source, but they are looking." She said this with the tone of someone delivering useful information and also, incidentally, establishing leverage. "You are, whether you intend to be or not, a variable in the current strategic environment. Sounds like that's true of most people who come through the gate," Buck said. "Most people who come through the gate are known quantities." Anise tilted her head slightly. "You are from a future that no longer exists, carrying knowledge of technologies that haven't been developed in this timeline, with a psychological profile our database has no precedent for. You are, Captain Rogers, extraordinarily interesting. I'm going to write that down," O'Neill said from the corridor entrance where he was leaning with his arms crossed. "For the days when Hammond makes me file reports." The intelligence exchange itself was conducted between Carter and a second Talkare named Aldwin, in a side chamber with datapads and star maps and the focused technical energy of two people who respected each other's competence despite themselves. O'Neill went with them, partly for oversight and partly because he trusted Anise approximately as far as he could throw her, which given the Talkare tunnel's low ceilings was not very far at all. Buck stayed in the main chamber with Daniel, which suited both of them. Daniel had been watching Anise watch Buck with the expression of a man assembling a theory. "She's going to ask you something," he said quietly. "Something that wasn't on the official agenda." "I know," Buck said. "She's been building to it since we arrived." "Any idea what?" "Something about my knowledge base. What I know about technology that doesn't exist yet in this timeline." He paused. "She wants to know if any of it is applicable to the Talkare's current situation." Daniel considered this. "Is it?" "Some of it, probably. That's not the question I'm worried about." Buck kept his voice low, even unhurried. "The question is what they'd do with it if I told them. The Talkares share intelligence selectively. They've been playing a 2,000-year game against the gold. If I give them something they can use, it goes into that game without any guarantee of where it comes out. You sound like you've dealt with intelligence agencies before." "In my future, everybody dealt with intelligence agencies." A brief pause. "Some of them were even honest." When Anise returned, alone, which was the thing that confirmed Daniel's read, she sat across from Buck with the careful posture of someone conducting a conversation they wanted to look informal. "The technology in your cryocapsule," she began. "The internal systems." Carter's preliminary analysis suggests components that are theoretically 2 centuries beyond Earth's current development. Carter's preliminary analysis is probably right, Buck said. The propulsion architecture in particular. The hibernation management systems. Anise's eyes were steady. If the underlying principles were shared with the Talkare, certain limitations in our current infiltration capabilities might be addressed. Buck finished. "Yes. I can see how they would be." A silence. "Will you share them?" Anise asked. Buck looked at her for a long moment. The amber light of the crystal tunnels made everything look warmer than it was. Outside, the wind moved across black basalt, and the planet offered nothing. "Tell me something first," he said. "The Talkare have been fighting the gold for 2,000 years. In that time, what have you actually won?" Anise's expression didn't change. But something behind it shifted. "We have prevented several system lords from achieving dominance," she said carefully. "We have preserved the balance of power among." "That's not winning," Buck said. Not unkindly. "That's maintenance. There's a difference." He leaned forward slightly. "I've seen what happens when people fight for 2,000 years to preserve a balance instead of end a war. The balance becomes the goal." The war becomes the reason for existing. He paused. I'm not saying that's what the Takare are doing. I'm asking, genuinely, what the Takare are fighting for. Not against. For. The silence that followed was longer than the previous one. When Anise finally spoke, something in her voice had changed. Not softened, exactly. Recalibrated. That, she said, is not a question our allies usually ask. Maybe they should, Buck said. I'll think about the technology. But I need to think about it in the context of what it's actually going to accomplish. He met her gaze evenly. That's not a no. It's a different kind of yes than you were expecting. On the walk back to the gate, O'Neill fell into step beside Buck and said nothing for 30 seconds, which with O'Neill meant he was composing something. For the record, he said finally, nobody talks to the Takare like that. Did it cause a problem? O'Neill thought about it. No. Which is somehow more unsettling. The village on P2S882 had no name for what had happened to it. Not because the people who lived there lacked language. They had language, a rich and specific one that Daniel had spent 40 minutes cataloging with barely concealed excitement, but because some events exist outside the vocabulary that ordinary life generates. The raid had come 6 weeks ago. Jaffa soldiers, bearing the mark of a minor system lord whose territorial ambitions exceeded his military reach. They had taken 31 people. Adults, mostly. Some older children. The villagers who remained moved through their days with the particular quality of people who had reorganized their entire existence around an absence. SG-1 was there for logistical reasons, a Naquata trace in the region, a potential gate address in the village's oral history that Daniel wanted to document. They had arrived to find the raid's aftermath, and Hammond's standing orders were clear on the subject of gold slave taking. Document, assess, report. Do not engage without authorization. Do not make promises that Earth's resources could not keep. Buck had read those orders. He understood their logic. He was doing his level best to apply it. He was finding it difficult. The woman who kept finding reasons to walk past the spot where SG-1 had set up their field equipment was named Sarah. She was perhaps 40, with the careful, controlled movement of someone managing grief through task completion, always something in her hands, always a direction of travel, always a reason to be somewhere that happened to be near the strangers with the weapons and the radio equipment, and the off-world look about them. Buck recognized the behavior. He had seen it in people who needed to ask something and hadn't yet decided whether asking was safe. He separated himself from the equipment setup with the casualness of a man stretching his legs and positioned himself near the village well, which was on Sarah's established circuit, and waited. She stopped pretending to be there for other reasons on her third pass. You came through the ring, she said. Her dialect was close enough to the root language Daniel had identified that Buck caught most of it, and Daniel's whispered translation through the radio earpiece covered the rest. Yes, Buck said. The ring goes to other places. She said it carefully, like a statement that was also a question. Many places. She looked at her hands. The warriors who took our people. They came from the ring. They went back through it. A pause that had weight in it. Could someone go back through the ring the other way? To where they went? Buck was quiet for a moment. Hammond's orders were very specific. Document, assess, report. Do not make promises. I don't know, he said, which was honest. But I know people who might. It wasn't a promise. He was careful that it wasn't a promise. But the way Sarah's face changed, the fractional release of something she'd been holding rigid for 6 weeks, made the distinction feel uncomfortably technical. He brought it to O'Neill that evening, in the straightforward way he'd learned O'Neill preferred. No preamble, no hedging, just the situation and the question. O'Neill listened with his eyes on the middle distance, and the expression of a man conducting an internal argument he'd had many times before. I know, he said when Buck finished. The gate address, Buck said. If Daniel can confirm it from the oral history, we know where the Jaffa took them. That's not a rescue operation. That's just information. Information has a way of becoming operations, O'Neill said. Especially with this team. I know. O'Neill was quiet. The village around them was settling into its evening rhythms. Cooking fires, the sound of children who were young enough that 6 weeks had begun to return them to something approaching normal, the specific silence of adults for whom it hadn't. We document the gate address, O'Neill said finally. We bring it back to Hammond. Whatever happens after that is above my pay grade. He looked at Buck directly. That's all we do. You understand? Yes, Buck said. I need you to mean that. I mean it, Buck said. And did. And also understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent his life in the gap between what orders permitted and what conscience required, that meaning it today did not guarantee anything about tomorrow. Daniel confirmed the gate address from 2 independent sources in the oral history and cross-referenced it against the SGC database from his field tablet. The address matched a planet in a contested sector, a processing facility operated by a system lord named Nearest, minor enough that he rarely appeared in SGC threat assessments, but significant enough to maintain several off-world operations. 31 people, Daniel said quietly, looking at his tablet. And that's just this village. Nearest has been operating in this sector for at least 2 years. Based on the raid frequency the villagers are describing. Don't, O'Neill said. Jack. I know what you're going to say. Don't say it tonight. Daniel closed his tablet. Buck sat with Tilk outside the building SG-1 was using for shelter, and the specific darkness of a planet with no light pollution and 2 moons that were both currently below the horizon. The stars were extraordinary. Different configuration than Earth's sky, different density in some regions, but the fundamental experience of looking up at more light than darkness remained constant across every world Buck had visited. You are troubled, Tilk said. I keep doing math, Buck said. 31 people. However many villages. However many minor system lords running processing facilities in contested sectors. And then the major ones on top of that. He paused. In my future, the one I woke up in the first time, Earth had been to war and come through it. There was something left to build on. Here, every time you build something, there's a system lord ready to take it apart. Yes, Tilk said. Simply. How do you keep going? Tilk considered the question with genuine attention. He did not answer quickly, which Buck had learned meant the answer was going to be worth the wait. For many years, Tilk said, I served Apophis. I believed. Not fully, there was always a part of me that knew. But I served. His eyes were on the stars. When I stopped serving, I did not stop because I believed victory was certain. I stopped because the alternative was to continue participating in something I knew to be wrong. A pause. The mathematics of the galaxy's suffering is not a calculation that produces hope. But individual choices are not subject to galactic mathematics. Buck sat with that for a while. The woman, Tilk said. Sarah. Yes. You did not promise her anything. No. But you intend to do something. Buck looked at the sky. The stars looked back with the indifference of distance. I intend to make sure Hammond has everything he needs to make the right call, he said. What happens after that is above your pay grade, Tilk said. The faintest inflection. Not quite humor. Something adjacent. O'Neill's rubbing off on me, Buck said. That, Tilk said, is not necessarily a problem. Ball did not make mistakes. This was not arrogance, or rather, it was arrogance, but the functional kind, the kind built on a foundation of actual capability rather than simple self-regard. In 5,000 years of existence, Ball had survived the deaths of system lords who were stronger, smarter, and better resourced than he was, not through luck but through the disciplined application of a single principle. Information was the only currency that didn't devalue. He knew about Buck Rogers before the SGC knew he knew. The subspace signature from the cryocapsule's arrival had been logged by 17 different monitoring stations across 3 star systems. Most system lords had dismissed it as sensor noise or minor gate activity. Ball had pulled the raw data, run his own analysis, and arrived at a conclusion that was, by any reasonable standard, impossible. He found it interesting precisely because it was impossible. The intelligence reached SG-1 through a TalkRA source, a fragment of intercepted communication that Anise forwarded to the SGC with unusual speed, which O'Neill noted was itself information. When Ball moved quickly on something, it meant the window for responding was already closing. The intercept contained three things: confirmation that Ball had identified the cryocapsule's origin signature, a reference to Buck Rogers by name, which meant Ball had accessed records that the SGC had classified at a level that implied either a significant intelligence breach or a gold infiltrator closer to the mountain than anyone wanted to think about, and a single operational directive in gold that Tilk translated with the flat economy he used when the content was serious. Acquire the temporal anomaly. Condition intact. Hammond called the briefing for 0600. Buck arrived to find the full team already seated and the general standing at the head of the table with the expression he used when the situation was bad enough that performance of concern would be a waste of everyone's time. "You have a system lord's attention," Hammond said. "I've had worse things' attention," Buck said and sat down. The briefing covered what the SGC knew about Ball, which was extensive and not reassuring. Unlike most system lords, who operated primarily through fear and technological superiority, Ball operated through information and patience, which made him significantly more dangerous in the long run and significantly harder to outmaneuver in the short term. He had survived Anubis. He had survived the replicators. He had survived multiple apparent deaths through a cloning program that the SGC had disrupted but not eliminated. "He wants you intact," Carter said, pulling up the intercept on the briefing room display. "That's actually useful information. It means his initial approach will be acquisition rather than force." "Comforting," Buck said. "It means we have a window," she continued. "Ball doesn't move openly against the SGC without significant preparation. He prefers proxies, leverage, and information operations. If we assume his first move is intelligence gathering rather than direct action, we have time to complicate his picture." "How?" O'Neill asked. "We give him a worse picture to look at," Buck said. The table looked at him. "He knows I exist. He knows approximately where I am. He knows I came from a future that doesn't match this timeline, which means he's calculating what I know and whether it's worth extracting." Buck leaned forward. "What he doesn't know is the quality of my actual knowledge, how actionable it is, how current it is relative to this timeline's development curve. Right now he's treating me as a high-value unknown. If we can shift that assessment, make me look like a lower-value known, he recalculates the acquisition cost." O'Neill was doing the particular expression he used when someone said something he wanted to disagree with and couldn't find the grounds. "You want to make yourself look less valuable. I want to make myself look like more trouble than I'm worth for what he'd actually get." Buck paused. "It's not that different from looking non-threatening to a Jaffa patrol. You just have to know which instruments Ball is reading." The plan that developed over the next 4 hours was not elegant. Elegant plans, in Buck's experience, were plans that had been oversimplified to the point where they felt elegant, which usually meant someone had stopped thinking about what happened when the plan met reality. This plan was functional, specific, and honest about its own failure points, which Buck considered the appropriate level of sophistication. The core element was a controlled intelligence leak, a carefully constructed data package that the SGC's counterintelligence team would introduce into channels known to be monitored by Ball's network. The package would contain accurate but strategically selected information about Buck's knowledge base, framed to suggest that his future timeline knowledge was significantly less applicable to current-era technology than Ball's analysts had apparently estimated. Carter spent 6 hours building the data package with the precise, unhappy focus of someone constructing a very good lie. Daniel contributed cultural framing. The way information was contextualized mattered as much as its content, and Daniel's instinct for how sophisticated non-human intelligences processed historical narrative was, in this context, genuinely invaluable. Buck contributed the knowledge itself, sitting across from Carter in the lab, walking her through the actual state of his future timeline technology knowledge, letting her assess what was actionable and what wasn't, what could be truthfully downgraded and what couldn't. It was, he reflected, the most honest deception he'd ever participated in. "Your propulsion knowledge," Carter said, not looking up from her screen. "The hibernation management systems," Anise asked about those. "Yes." She was right that they're applicable. More applicable than what we're going to tell Ball. "I know." Carter looked up. "If Ball ever gets accurate information about what you actually know, he'll reassess," Buck said. "Which is why this only works once. We get one move." He met her eyes. "We need to make sure it's the right one." Carter was quiet for a moment. "You're very calm about a system lord targeting you for acquisition. I've been targeted for acquisition before." At her expression, he elaborated. "In my future, there were several factions who considered a man unstuck from his own timeline to be a useful resource. The principle is consistent across centuries, it turns out." "What did you do?" Buck considered the question. "Made friends faster than enemies," he said, and stayed moving. "It was Tilk who identified the flaw in the plan at 2,200 hours, when the rest of the team was running final checks on the data package. He brought it to Buck quietly, in the corridor outside the lab, with the directness that Buck had come to rely on precisely because Tilk did not soften things that needed to be said clearly. "The data package addresses Ball's analytical assessment," Tilk said. "It does not address his contingency." Buck looked at him. "What contingency?" "Ball does not rely on a single approach. While his intelligence network processes the leak, he will simultaneously activate a secondary operation, a physical asset, already positioned, whose objective will be acquisition regardless of the analytical picture." Tilk paused. "Ball does not change his objective when the information changes. He changes his method." Buck absorbed this. "You're saying the leak buys us time but doesn't change the outcome." "It changes the timeline," Tilk said. "It does not change the destination." They stood in the corridor for a moment, the mountain humming around them with the particular late-night energy of a facility that never fully slept. "Then we need to change the destination," Buck said. "Yes," Tilk said. "And we have perhaps 48 hours in which to decide how." The space station designated Kelmax 7 did not appear in any SGC database. This was, in itself, information. Ball maintained several off-the-record facilities, installations that existed in the gaps between official Goa'uld territorial records, operated by personnel whose loyalty was to Ball personally rather than to the system lord hierarchy. The Takare had known about Kelmax 7 for 11 months. They had not shared this information with the SGC, which was the kind of selective intelligence management that made O'Neill's jaw tighten in a very specific way whenever it came up. Anise had shared it now, which meant the Takare had decided that Ball's interest in Buck Rogers represented a threat to something they valued more than the operational security of their knowledge about the station. Buck filed that calculation away for later consideration. Kelmax 7 was a mid-sized facility in a system with no inhabited planets and no strategic resources, the kind of location chosen specifically because nobody had a reason to be there. It served as a staging point for Ball's intelligence operations in the sector, which meant it had communication infrastructure, a small permanent crew of Jaffa and human operatives, and a ship bay with capacity for 3 vessels. It also, as of 36 hours ago, contained a Takare operative named Renata who had been attempting to extract intelligence on Ball's secondary acquisition plans and had instead been captured, which was how the Takare had decided that sharing the station's existence with the SGC was suddenly acceptable. "They want us to go in and get her out," O'Neill said, at the briefing that Hammond had called with the particular economy of a man who already knew what he was going to authorize and wanted the formalities completed efficiently. "They want us to go in and get her out," Hammond confirmed. And while we're there, retrieve whatever intelligence she'd gathered before capture. A pause. And if possible, confirm or deny the existence of Ball's secondary acquisition asset. The asset targeting Buck, Carter said. That too. Buck studied the station schematics that the Talkare had provided, partial, annotated in a combination of gold script and what appeared to be Talkare shorthand, with several sections marked as unverified. He had spent the previous evening with these schematics and had opinions about them that he suspected were going to be relevant. The ship bay, he said. The approach vector the Talkare are recommending brings us in on the station's communication array side. The bay is on the opposite face. He traced the layout with one finger. If Ball's secondary asset is already en route, or already docked, we won't know until we're committed to an approach that puts the entire station between us and our exit. Carter leaned over the schematics. He's right. If we come in on the recommended vector, we're blind to bay activity until we're within weapons range. So we don't use the recommended vector, O'Neill said. The alternative approach brings us across the sensor array's primary sweep, Carter said. Can we time it? It's a 30-second window. Every 8 minutes. She looked at Buck. Can you fly within a 30-second window? Buck considered the question with the professional seriousness it deserved. What are we flying? Modified Teltac. Cargo vessel. Gold design, decent maneuverability for its class, cloaking device that works approximately 90% of the time. What happens the other 10%? We become visible to everything in sensor range. 30 seconds, Buck said. Yes. O'Neill looked at Hammond. Hammond gave the nod. They left at 0400, through the gate to a Talkare-controlled world where the Teltac was pre-positioned in a shallow canyon under a thermal blanket that Carter removed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The ship was smaller than Buck had expected and more functional than it looked. The interior smelled of recycled air and aquata and the particular metallic undertone that Buck associated with vessels that had seen real use rather than ceremonial deployment. He took the pilot's position without being asked, which O'Neill noted and did not object to, which Buck interpreted as the closest thing to a formal assignment he was likely to receive. The flight to Kelmax 7 took 4 hours through hyperspace. A transit experience that Buck found genuinely extraordinary and filed in the same mental category as the first time he'd seen P3X774's double moons, things that would have been remarkable in any universe and remained remarkable even in one where he was trying very hard to stay tactically focused. He used the transit time to learn the ship. Not the theory of it, Carter had covered the theory, but the feel. The way it responded to course corrections. The lag between input and reaction on the lateral thrusters. The specific vibration profile when the hyperdrive was operating at the upper edge of its efficiency band versus the middle. Every ship had a personality. The Teltax was pragmatic and slightly stubborn, like a vehicle that had been asked to do things it wasn't designed for often enough that it had developed opinions about it. He liked it. They dropped out of hyperspace at the calculated distance and Buck brought the cloak online before running the approach calculation in his head, sensor sweep timing, approach angle, the 30-second window that repeated every 8 minutes like a metronome. 30 seconds from now, he said. We go. I need quiet in the cockpit from Mark. O'Neill, to his credit, simply said, Understood. The approach was the cleanest thing Buck had done since arriving in the Stargate Universe. It was pure piloting, no politics, no diplomatic calculation, no navigating the gap between orders and conscience. Just the ship, the window, and the math. He brought the Teltac across the sensor array's primary sweep with 6 seconds to spare and tucked them into the station's sensor shadow on the bay's side with a course correction that Carter later described in her mission report as unnecessarily precise, in the best possible way. The bay contained 2 vessels. One was a standard gold patrol ship. The other was something different. Smaller, faster-looking, with modifications that Carter identified as consistent with Ball's personal courier configuration. The secondary asset wasn't en route. It was already here. We have a problem, Carter said quietly. We have several, Buck said. Prioritize. The extraction itself fell to Tilk and O'Neill. They moved through the station's internal corridors with the practiced efficiency of a team that had done this kind of work enough times that communication had compressed to gesture and eye contact. Carter ran electronic countermeasures from the Teltac, keeping the station's internal sensors looped on a 30-second delay that bought the extraction team a navigational advantage that was, as she noted, exactly as reliable as everything else that operated at 30-second intervals on this mission. Buck stayed with the ship. This was the correct tactical decision. They needed a pilot ready for immediate departure. And he had agreed to it without argument, which had apparently surprised O'Neill enough to mention it. I pick my moments, Buck had said. He monitored the extraction team's progress through radio contact, tracking their position against the partial schematics and updating his departure calculation as variables changed. Renata was in a detention level 2 floors below the bay, alive, according to Tilk's initial assessment, and coherent enough to move under her own power, which simplified the extraction geometry considerably. The complication arrived, as complications did, at the moment of highest operational exposure. The courier's ship in the bay was not empty. The figure that emerged from it was human in appearance. Male, mid-40s, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been briefed on the situation and found it manageable. He walked directly to the Teltac's berth, which meant he either had sensor access to the bay that Buck's countermeasures hadn't fully covered, or he had known the Teltac would be there before it arrived. He stopped outside the ship and looked directly at the cockpit viewport, which under normal circumstances he should not have been able to see through from that angle. He was looking directly at Buck. Buck held very still. The man smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, the kind that communicated that the person smiling knew more about the current situation than you did, and wanted you to know that they knew it. Buck had seen that smile before. In his previous future, it had usually preceded either a very interesting conversation or a significant amount of violence. He opened the Teltac's external comm. Can I help you? Captain Rogers. The man's voice was pleasant, educated, carrying the faint harmonic resonance of a gold symbiote. Not a system lord. The register was wrong for that. An operative. Balls. I was asked to extend an invitation. I tend to prefer invitations that come through the front door, Buck said. Ball thought you might. He also thought you'd appreciate a direct conversation more than a prolonged acquisition effort. A slight pause. He's right about most things. Buck's hand was on the Teltac's defensive systems. His eyes were on the bay entrance where O'Neill and Tilk would emerge in approximately 4 minutes if the extraction timeline held. 4 minutes. Tell me about the invitation, Buck said. The invitation, as it turned out, was not metaphorical. Ball wanted a meeting. Neutral location, no Jaffa present, direct communication through his operative, as intermediary. The terms were specific enough to suggest genuine intent and vague enough to suggest Ball retained options he hadn't disclosed, which was, Buck was learning, simply how Ball operated. The man, the operative, whose name was given as Heron, had been a gold host long enough that the distinction between his own personality and his symbiotes had become largely academic. He delivered Ball's terms with the smooth professionalism of someone who had made many offers on behalf of many powerful entities and had learned to present them without personal investment in the outcome. Buck kept him talking. It wasn't difficult. Heron was good at conversation, genuinely good, the kind of good that came from practice rather than nature, and he seemed to find Buck's questions about Ball's motivations legitimately interesting rather than transparent stalling. Buck asked about Ball's specific interest in temporal anomalies. About what the System Lord believed Buck's future timeline knowledge actually contained. About the nature of the offer, what Ball was prepared to give in exchange for what he wanted. Heron answered with the careful precision of someone authorized to negotiate within specific parameters. Ball was offering, in essence, protection. His intelligence network had identified at least 2 other system lords who were aware of Buck's existence. Their interest was less refined than Ball's, less acquire intact and more acquire and dissect. Ball's offer was genuine in the sense that Ball's self-interest aligned with Buck's survival, at least temporarily. "He wants a partner," Buck said. "He wants a resource," Heron said. "But he's willing to treat the resource well. That's a meaningful distinction." To Ball, less so. O'Neill and Tilk came through the bay entrance at 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which was ahead of schedule. Renata was between them, moving steadily. Carter's voice came through Buck's earpiece in the same moment. "Internal sensors cycling back online in 90 seconds. We need to be gone." And the tactical geometry of the next 90 seconds resolved itself with the clean, unambiguous clarity that Buck's mind produced under time pressure. He cut the external comm and brought the Teltac systems to full power in one movement. Heron stepped back from the viewport with the expression of a man who had expected this and was not particularly bothered by it. He raised one hand, not a threatening gesture, Buck noted. An acknowledgement. The specific body language of someone who had delivered their message and considered the conversation complete regardless of the response. O'Neill had Renata secured in the rear compartment before the bay doors finished opening. Tilk was in the co-pilot position 12 seconds after that. Carter's countdown reached 0 as Buck brought the Teltac out of the bay on a vector that used the station's own mass as cover for the first 40 seconds of departure, buying them sensor shadow until they had enough distance to make the jump to hyperspace. Nobody spoke until the hyperspace tunnel closed around them and Kelmax 7 was several light years behind. "The operative," O'Neill said. "You were talking to him?" "Yes." "For about 4 minutes?" "Yes." "Want to tell me what you talked about?" Buck told him. Completely, without editing, including the parts where Ball's offer had contained elements that were, in cold tactical terms, not entirely without logic. O'Neill listened with his eyes forward and the particular stillness he used when he was processing something he didn't want to react to before he'd finished processing it. When Buck finished, O'Neill said, "He's not wrong about the other system lords." "No." "Which makes the offer more complicated than it should be." "Yes." "You didn't consider it," O'Neill said. It was not quite a question. "I considered it," Buck said. "For about 30 seconds. Then I thought about what accepting it would actually mean, not just for me, but for everyone Ball would expect me to help him against. And I thought about the Verani. And the 31 people from P2S882. He paused. And I thought about the fact that in 5,000 years of operation, Ball has never once treated a resource well when a better option presented itself. O'Neill was quiet for a moment. "Good reasoning. It's the only kind worth having." Renata recovered quickly, which Tilk said was consistent with Takare resilience and Carter said was consistent with excellent symbiote biology, and O'Neill said was consistent with the universe's pattern of giving them just enough good news to keep the bad news company. She had retrieved partial intelligence before her capture, fragments, incomplete, but enough. Ball's secondary acquisition asset had not been Heron. Heron was a messenger. The actual asset was already on Earth. The silence in the Teltac was complete for approximately 3 seconds. "On Earth," O'Neill said. "An operative embedded in civilian infrastructure," Renata said. Her voice was steady, the voice of someone delivering a briefing rather than a crisis, which Buck suspected was a Takari trait rather than an individual one. "We have a partial identity profile. Sufficient for your people to locate them if acted upon immediately." "How long have they been there?" Carter asked. "Based on the operational timeline, several weeks." "Before Buck arrived," O'Neill said. "Yes." Ball positioned assets against multiple contingencies. This one was dormant until the cryocapsule's arrival triggered activation. Renata looked at Buck with the focused attention of a Takare operative assessing a variable. "You were not the target initially. You became the target." "Lucky me," Buck said. Hammond had the full briefing within 20 minutes of their gate return, which meant the SGC's counterintelligence team was active within 25 and the partial identity profile was being cross-referenced against civilian databases within 30. Buck sat in the debrief room and answered every question with the completeness of a man who had learned that incomplete debriefs created problems that complete ones prevented, and watched Hammond's face move through the specific sequence of expressions, concern, calculation, decision, that characterized the general managing a situation that was serious without being unrecoverable. The operative was identified at 1847 hours. A civilian contractor with legitimate SGC access credentials. Not mountain access, but supply chain access, the kind of peripheral connection that provided observation capability without triggering the deeper security scrutiny reserved for personnel with direct program knowledge. The arrest was clean and quiet, handled by people trained for exactly this kind of work, and by 2,100 hours the immediate threat was contained. Buck was in the commissary when O'Neill found him, working through a late meal with the focused attention of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 16 hours and was now experiencing the metabolic reckoning. "Operatives in custody," O'Neill said, sitting across from him. "Counterintelligence says he'll take time to fully debrief, but the immediate threat is neutralized. Ball will send another one," Buck said. "Eventually." "Yes." O'Neill picked up a coffee cup that someone had left on the table and examined it. "But eventually is better than immediately." Buck nodded. He ate for a moment. The commissary was quiet, late enough that most of the mountain's population was either sleeping or on shift, and the few people present had the focused, inward quality of night workers everywhere. "The offer," Buck said. "Balls. You said his reasoning wasn't wrong about the other system lords." "I did." "You weren't wrong either." Buck put down his fork. "There are at least 2 system lords who know I exist and whose interest is less refined than Ball's. That problem doesn't go away because his operative is in custody." "No," O'Neill said. "It doesn't. So at some point," Buck said, "we're going to have to deal with it directly. Not manage it. Not leak carefully constructed intelligence packages at it. Actually deal with it." O'Neill looked at him with the expression he used when someone had arrived at a conclusion he'd already reached and was evaluating whether they'd gotten there the right way. "Yeah," he said. "We are. I want to be in the room when that decision gets made," Buck said. "Not as a resource. As someone withstanding." O'Neill set down the coffee cup. The commissary hummed around them with the sound of a mountain that never slept, built around a ring that connected to thousands of worlds, operated by people who had decided that humanity's survival was worth the cost of knowing what was actually out there. "I'll talk to Hammond," O'Neill said. It wasn't a promise either. But the way he said it made the distinction feel less important than it had in a village on P2S882, and Buck recognized the difference. The particular weight of words spoken by someone who meant them, in a place where meaning them was worth something. "Thank you," Buck said. O'Neill picked up the abandoned coffee, decided against it, and put it back down. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Hammond's going to want a full psychological evaluation first. I've had worse. From a gold-aware military psychologist with clearance level 7 and a professional suspicion of people who are too well-adjusted." Buck considered this. "Define too well-adjusted." O'Neill stood up. "Get some sleep, Rogers. Tomorrow's going to be complicated." Buck watched him go, then looked at the table, the plain, functional surface of a commissary in a mountain built around the most extraordinary piece of technology in human history, and felt, for the first time since arriving in this universe, something that was not adaptation or assessment, or the managed forward motion of a man who had learned to keep moving. He felt, quietly and without drama, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Which was, he reflected, exactly how the last one had started. 6 weeks after Buck Rogers came through the Stargate, General Hammond filed a personnel status report that was, by the standards of SGC documentation, remarkably straightforward. It read, in the relevant section, Captain William Rogers, USAF, RET, anomalous circumstances, has completed field evaluation period. Performance assessment, exceptional. Recommendation, full operational integration, SG-1 augmented roster, pending psychological clearance and formal reinstatement proceedings. The psychological clearance had taken 4 sessions with Dr. Mackenzie, who had emerged from the final one looking slightly more philosophical than he'd entered and had signed the clearance form without comment. The formal reinstatement proceedings were ongoing, a bureaucratic process of genuinely impressive complexity, given that the subject had been legally dead for 5 centuries and the branch of service he was being reinstated into had changed substantially in the intervening period. The JAG officer assigned to the case had requested 3 extensions and was reportedly considering a career change. Buck had found the whole process clarifying in a way he hadn't expected. In his previous future, New Chicago, the Directorate, Wilma Deering's patient exasperation at his 20th century instincts. His reinstatement had been similarly complicated, similarly bureaucratic, and had similarly resolved itself through the intervention of people who decided that what he could contribute was worth the administrative inconvenience of how he'd arrived. The specific forms were different. The underlying human calculus was identical. Some things were constant across centuries. He was increasingly grateful for that. The morning Hammond signed the final integration order, Buck was in the gate room watching a standard SG-9 departure. Chevrons locking in sequence, the kawoosh of the wormhole establishing, the team moving through with the practiced efficiency of people for whom this was a Tuesday. He had watched gate departures every chance he got since arriving, not because the sight had stopped being extraordinary but because the ordinariness of it to everyone else was something he wanted to understand. The point at which the impossible became routine. The threshold where wonder became competence. He wasn't there yet. He suspected he wouldn't be for a long time. He was comfortable with that. The immediate strategic situation had stabilized, which in SGC terms meant the acute crises had been managed and the chronic ones were in their normal state of slow, grinding pressure. Ball had not moved directly against the SGC following the Kelmax 7 operation. Renata's intelligence, combined with the counterintelligence work after the operative's arrest, had apparently shifted his calculus toward patience. He would reassess. He would try again. But not yet, and not the same way. The 2 system lords whose interest was less refined than Ball's remained a background concern. Hammond had convened a planning session that Buck had attended, as someone was standing, as O'Neill had quietly arranged, and the conversation had been honest about both the threat and the limits of what the SGC could do about it with current resources. Buck had contributed 3 operational observations that Carter had subsequently described as uncomfortably practical, which he had decided to take as a compliment. The Veronese situation had resolved in the way that SGC situations involving gold slave-taking usually resolved, slowly, partially, and with the specific moral residue of outcomes that were better than the worst case but worse than the right case. A follow-up mission had confirmed the gate address from the oral history. The planet in the contested sector was real. The 31 people were real. A rescue operation had been authorized, planned, and executed over 2 weeks, led by SG-1 with 2 support teams. Buck had flown the extraction. Of the 31 taken, 24 had been recovered. 7 had not been found, and the operational assessment was that they had been moved before the mission could reach them. Sarah had been at the gate when SG-1 came back through. Her daughter was among the 24. Buck did not consider the 7 a success. He also did not consider them a reason to stop. The Jaffa situation was more complex and more slow-moving, which was the nature of things that mattered most. Ragnar had not committed to the rebellion following their meeting on Chulak. But Dracy, his son, the young warrior with the hungry eyes, had made contact with Tilk through a back channel 3 weeks later. The contact was exploratory, cautious, and entirely unofficial. It was also, Tilk had said with characteristic understatement, significant. Buck had written Dracy a letter. Not an official communication, nothing that touched SGC channels or Talk-RA networks, or the formal machinery of galactic diplomacy. A personal letter, written by hand on actual paper, passed through Tilk's back channel, that said approximately what Buck had said in the courtyard on Shellac, that trust was built, not declared. That freedom was worth its cost even when the cost was higher than expected. That the shape of the thing you were fighting for mattered more than the shape of the thing you were fighting against. He didn't know if it would matter. He had sent it anyway. On a Wednesday afternoon, 5 days after Hammond signed the integration order, O'Neill found Buck in the auxiliary equipment room doing what had become his standard pre-mission routine. Checking his kit with the systematic thoroughness of a pilot running pre-flight, every item confirmed in sequence, nothing assumed. "Ready?" O'Neill said. Buck closed his kit bag. Through the equipment room's small window, he could see the gate room below, the great ring waiting, the ramp clean and ready, Tilk and Carter already in position with the particular focused stillness of people prepared to go somewhere that required preparation. "Yes," Buck said. "Daniel wants to brief you on the cultural contact protocols for P4X designation something. There's a population that may have ancient-derived oral traditions, and he wants everyone primed before first contact." "I'll listen to the whole thing," Buck said. "Even the parts he thinks we're not listening to." O'Neill looked at him with the expression that had started, over 6 weeks, to lose its measuring quality and acquire something more straightforward. "You know Hammond's going to keep putting you on the hard ones." "I know. Because you keep handling them." "I know that too." O'Neill was quiet for a moment. In the gate room below, Walter Harriman was beginning the dialing sequence, the chevrons locking with the mechanical certainty of a device that had been doing this for millions of years before humans found it, and would presumably continue long after. The sound carried up through the mountain like a heartbeat. "For what it's worth," O'Neill said, which was his standard preamble to things he meant but found uncomfortable to mean. "You fit." Buck picked up his kit bag. "I had a good team to fit into." "Don't say that to their faces. Carter will get emotional and Tilk will deny it and Daniel will write a paper about it." Buck smiled. "And you?" "I'll deny it too." O'Neill moved toward the door. "Come on. We've got a galaxy to deal with." Buck took one last look at the gate room window. The wormhole establishing now, the event horizon shimmering with the particular blue-white light that never quite looked the same twice, the team moving into position with the ease of people who had learned to carry extraordinary things lightly. He had been displaced from his own time twice. He had woken up in 2 futures that weren't his, in universes that hadn't arranged themselves around his comfort or his plans, and he had found, in both of them, that the work was the same. Keep moving. Make friends faster than enemies. Pay attention to the instruments that matter. Stand at the gate. He walked out of the equipment room and down to the ramp, and the Stargate, that ancient, patient, extraordinary ring, waited for him the way it waited for everyone, without sentiment and without judgment, simply open, simply ready, connecting the small bright point of one world to the vast and complicated dark of everything beyond it. Buck Rogers walked through. William Rogers had already survived the impossible once before arriving in the Stargate Universe, and that prior survival was, ultimately, what made him dangerous to the things worth being dangerous to. Not dangerous in the sense of firepower or ancient technology, or the galaxy-spanning political leverage that system lords traded like currency. Dangerous in the simpler, more durable sense, a man who had already lost one world and rebuilt himself around something other than grief. Who had looked at a universe running on military protocol and classified necessity and galactic-scale terror and decided, without drama, that it was worth showing up for. The SGC's records would log him as an anomalous arrival, successfully integrated, field-rated exceptional. The TalkRA files would note a human operative of unusual psychological stability and strategic instinct. Ball's intelligence network would maintain a standing acquisition directive that was never fully closed, because Ball did not close things that retained potential value. Rachnar would eventually commit to the rebellion. Whether Draes's letter had anything to do with that, nobody could say with certainty. Tilk thought it did. Tilk did not say so. He didn't need to. Sarah's daughter remembered the pilot who flew the extraction. She told her children about him, years later, in a village that had learned the gate could bring back as well as take away. Buck Rogers had already survived the impossible once. The Stargate Universe, it turned out, was simply the second time. Indeed. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.